All right. Usually in my classes I do first, afterwards we do together, but this is so boring and should be fairly simple. I think we can do it all together at once. Hello. Hi. Sure. Run faster.
Okay, I'm not the last one.
So, if you already have After Effects open, please close it. Oh, damn it. Then, in the folder we have, or in the folder of today, by the way, this is the date of today. Like, this is the year, this is the month, and this is the day. Just if you were wondering what all these weird numbers mean. So you will always get, like, for the After Effects classes, the AE folders with the date. So you can just put it all in one folder and it will all be sorted nicely. Then, in here we have an images folder with some things that we will work with later today. Then there is a nice program that is called Paparazzi, which you can install if you want. I'm not quite sure how compatible it is with Yosemite because it is fairly old. But what it does is, you open it up, and then you can put in a URL. And then you open the URL with that program, and you can save it as a PDF. But really as an editable PDF. So if you take a screenshot of your Facebook page, you could actually just open it in Illustrator and change texts or move boxes and stuff like this. So it really converts the website into an editable PDF, which can be quite nice sometimes. Then we have a couple of plugins. One of them is legal. Let's start with the legal one, which is the very first one. It is called FX Console. So there, you just double-click the zip to, well, unzip it. Hello.
I'm so sorry.
Then, I'll catch you up in a moment. Open everything up. Do you have downloaded the files? No. All right, then I have a stick for you. So, we open up the DMG, and inside of the DMG, we should then see an installer. FX Console Installer. There, we just double-click to open up the installer, then we say, yes, we do want to open that. And then it's a regular installer where we just always click next, 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 type in our password, -123.
We don't need to choose any of these?
No, just next. And then on the last screen, it should say that the FX console was installed, in my case also for 15.3, and click Finish to close the installer. So you click Finish. So nice. Yes. So this was fairly simple.
You say that.
I say that. Next. So the other two plugins are optional. So the FX console we will use during our classes. The other ones, not necessarily, but I give them to you if you want to. If you don't want to, you don't have to. The first one, the Need Video Reduce Noise, is a very, very good plugin to reduce noise in videos. So especially when you have filmed something for green screen or something like this, then you really want the least amount of noise possible. And yeah, reduce noise or Need Video is very good at it. I sometimes even use it to reduce noise in pictures. I just open up the picture in After Effects and reduce the noise with this because it is just that good. No, for sound you would need to use Adobe Audition. So, if you do want to install in video, what you do is, you just open up the zip, copy this folder, create a new window, then you go to the application folder, into the After Effects folder, so Applications, After Effects, then plugins, and then you just paste it right in here. That's it. Yeah, so you can see here, I have it in there as well. So After Effects CC 2017,
But I had to
plugins, and
which
paste.
folder did I have to copy?
Plugins.
From
Now, the next one is installed the exact same way, which is Twixtor Pro 6. Twixtor is a very good program if you want to create slow motion videos. So what it does is, even when you slow down footage to lower than the 25 frames that you have, then it will create images in between and more from one frame to the next one. So even though you did not film in slow motion, or even if you filmed in slow motion, you can slow it down even further with this plugin. Of course, at some point and in some situations you might get some weird artifacts, but in some cases it works very perfectly. So here, same process as before. You just double click it to open it up, select the Twixtor Pro 6 folder, hit Command C to copy, go to the same plugins folder inside of the artifacts folder, and paste it in there. I already have it in here. So then you should have these three folders inside of the plugins folder. So you need Video, Twixtor Pro, and Video Copilot. Very good. Next, we have another folder which is called Scripts. And in there are a couple of scripts that I got from other people where I thought this is useful, and there are some scripts that I have written myself because I wasn't satisfied with what other people did. In the first one, we have the underscore folder, decompose text, rdcomp setter, and the true comp duplicator. I will just briefly tell you what they are so you get an overview of what scripts can do. The underscore folder script creates a default folder structure in your project panel. So if you open up After Effects and you start a project, you usually just put stuff in the project panel, but it starts to get very unorganized after a while. But when you open up this script, then you already have like master comps, pre-comps, pictures, audio files, video files, and stuff like this. So you already have a folder structure where you're kind of forced to be a little bit more organized. So it doesn't hurt to have this in there. Decomposed text can sometimes be nice when you have a text written inside of After Effects, but you want to animate each letter very individually. So there are many different things that you can do with text layers to animate them, but sometimes you want to do something very custom, where like each letter comes from a different space. So then you would want each text to be on its own layer, and this is what this script does. Then we have the rdcomp setter. The rdcomp setter is useful when you import, for instance, a Photoshop file, because in Photoshop files, each group that you have is converted to a composition. But After Effects does not ask you what the settings of this composition should be, like how long it should be or what frame rate it should have. It will always take whatever the settings were from the last composition that you've created. So if you create a composition that is just 5 seconds long and 12 frames per second because you had, I don't know, a low frame rate project, then the Photoshop file will be imported with these settings, and all the groups or all the compositions will have the wrong settings. And with this you can say, take this comp and all the comps underneath it and set settings for it, so you don't have to do it composition by composition. We'll use that sooner or later. Then we have the true comp duplicator, which is not really necessary for you, but it's like you have created an animation with many pre-comps, but when you duplicate a composition to change things, only the master comp is duplicated, but when you have pre-comps, they aren't. I don't think that you will understood this. I will show it at some point with a proper example. Then we have the script UI panels, and all the scripts that start with any, so all the ones you see here, are scripts that I have written. I will go through them one by one during the course of our classes here. The main one that we will use is any.green. We will use that one in pretty much every project, and before I've always used a plugin that was called KVC, but it didn't do all the things that I wanted it to do. So I've written my own one. and we use that one.
How
Anyways,
long did it take you to like write one of them? Or is it always
completely different. This one took me like an hour. This one took me a week. So it's depending on what it can do and if I already knew how it worked. Because also this stuff there is really just self-taught. Just trying, and if it didn't work, just trying different. Alright, but later on I will show you what all of these do. But first, let's install them. We do that by selecting all the scripts except for the folder. Then you copy it, go back to the After Effects folder, and there, underneath the plugins, we also have presets and scripts. And you paste it directly into the scripts folder. Then we go back to the folder that you got from me today, go to the Script UI Panels folder, select all the scripts from there, copy them, go over to the Scripts UI Panels in the scripts folder from the After Effects folder, and there we paste it in. I also have a couple of other things in here, but you don't need to worry about those. Alright. Then, next. In After Effects, you cannot just simply change shortcuts. It just doesn't have an interface for it. I'm not quite sure why, but the developers just never built one. So, if you do want to change the After Effects shortcuts, you need to do that in a text file. It is a little bit complicated, but I will show you how it works. But for most machines, you do not have to do it. For all the German keyboards, I already have a fixed file prepared because some shortcuts do not exist on a German keyboard. So I've altered them. So here in the shortcuts folder is a file called Where to Find the Shortcut File. And in there, when you open that up, you see a link. So tilde library preferences Adobe After Effects. You can either move to that folder manually, or you can just select it, hit Command C to copy, open a new Finder window, and go to Go and Go to Folder. Then you could paste this path in there, hit Go, and then the Finder automatically moves to that folder. This is especially nice because the library folder by default is hidden. But this is something that you don't have to do unless you have a German keyboard, then you should go here. Then we see the different versions that are installed, and in here is a text file that is called After Effects Mac ENUS Shortcuts. And in there, if we open this up, we see a very long list of all the things that can have shortcuts, along with the shortcuts that they are assigned to. So here we can see that if you want to open up the mask feather, the shortcut would be Command-Shift-F. So here you would really just type in what sort of shortcut you want. Now there are 4 shortcuts that should be changed, but I've already done that in the separate file. But you could find them if you hit Command-F and look for trim. Here they are. There's the time trim in and the time trim out, as well as the time set in and time set out, because by default they are set to these opening and closing brackets, but without any modifiers. And on a German keyboard, you cannot create these without using modifiers. So,
How did you find this?
so again, for the German keyboards, you select the path that you see from the Where to Find AE shortcut file. Then you go to a new Finder window, click on Go, and then go to Folder. Paste it in there, hit Enter, and go into the 14.0 folder. Then you go back to the folder that you got from me, and there's a folder called, too many folders, Shortcut File for German Keyboard. This should also work if you, for instance, have a Swedish keyboard. I think then you also don't have the brackets without any modifiers. But if you run into issues during the break, I can take a look at your keyboard and adjust your file if necessary.
What did you change it to?
I changed it to option Ö and option Ä, or Ö and Ä.
Should we change anything if, I don't, normally I think my Danish keyboard is fine.
If it works, then it works. If it doesn't work, then I'll take a look during the break and fix it. But for the Germans, I already know that it does not work. So here we have another file that is called Adobe After Effects. Oh, mine is actually 14.2. I haven't updated mine on my laptop here. Well, should work, I think. So here, you copy it, and then you just paste it inside here.
But we should only do this if it's not working, right?
Yeah. Do you have a German keyboard? All right. Then I'll quickly come to you. Right. One more little thing. Some programs, you can easily switch the language, but some you don't. Usually in most of them you can't really change the language unless you reinstall it. And for each program, the tricks to force them to be in English are different. I don't know why. In After Effects, it's the weirdest one. So if you have installed it in German or whatever, but you want After Effects to be in English, what you do is you create a new text document, go to Format, make plain text, save that empty document, and just call it ae_force_english.txt and put it into the Documents folder. This is important. So we need to have in the Documents folder a file called ae_force_english, and as soon as you start After Effects, it will start in English. It doesn't work. As I said, it's very different for all the programs. In Photoshop, you need to rename a file within the program itself. For InDesign, there's also something where you need to delete something. It's weird. Nothing. We just need to have a file that is called ae_force_english.txt. Yeah, as long as it's named this way. Yeah. So that's it, and then your After Effects will be forced to be opened up in English.
Can you do this with any language you want?
No, only with English. But it could be installed in any language, and every language you could restore to English with this trick. But only to English and only with After Effects. I didn't know. I think the developers were high, and someone said we should have a button like to switch between the current language and the default English language. No. You know what we should do? We should create a file in the Documents folder. An empty file. And when it's named this way, then the program switches. Ooh, this makes sense. This is so smart.
The best part is that it's empty.
Yeah, it's really just a file that is named this way. I mean, it must have been so hard to program, like it needs to look into a folder, search for files, check the file names, instead of just saying, here, change this preference.
Yes or no?
It could have been just I don't know, it's just a small button in the preferences. But maybe they were like, but I don't know where to put it. I already have like 5 checkboxes. A 6th one, I can't count that many. I don't know.
Make a document.
Yeah, just make a document.
It's a text file.
Yeah. All right. I think we have everything installed that we wanted to install, so now we can open up After Effects and do some more changes. Yay! I think we are 2/3 there. No. So it is progress.
What about
Later on. Ugh. No, not all. One? No, here. Oh, of the others. One should read. Do not try to send emails to that email address you just saw. But Adobe got hacked, so I gave them an address that I don't use.
Adobe got hacked?
Yeah, and 2 million users and their credit
When did they get hacked?
cards.
When was that?
I don't know, it was like a year or two ago.
Ah,
It was a while back. But it was still like, of course they did.
Everyone got that.
Yeah.
yeah.
Alrighty. Now that you have After Effects open, what you want to do is go to After Effects, and then Preferences, and then General. The very first thing that you want to adjust is this checkbox here. So there are a lot of checkboxes, and I really think there could be just one more that says Force English Language, or something like that. No, just one more. Wouldn't hurt. Anyway, the one that we want to change is this one here, where it says allow scripts to write files and access network. And you do want to turn this on. Then, the rest here should be fine. Then we go to, this one is fine as well. This one is fine too. To import. So on the left-hand side, we go to the import tab. Let's call it that. And there we have sequence footage. And by default, it's usually set to 30, but you want to set it to 25. So just click onto the 20 or onto the 30, type in 25, and click outside. Then, output should be fine too. This should be fine as well. Labels is fine. Media and disk cache. So Adobe thinks that it's so smart, and they started using this disk cache. So what this does is, while you render something, I showed you last class that things get green, and once something is green, it can be played back. But there's only so much green stuff that can be put into your RAM. So the green stuff means it's in your RAM. But on your machines, you usually have 16 gigabytes of RAM. But what if you need more? Like some other programs are using up RAM, and you have a very long video, then not all of it can be stored within the RAM. So After Effects would start deleting frames, older ones. If you don't want this to happen, you would enable the disk cache, because then After Effects would copy things from the RAM before deleting it and putting it into the disk cache. So it does not need to render those frames, it can just grab them from the disk again. So this sounds like it's smart. The issue is that sometimes After Effects saves something from the RAM onto the disk cache, but then you change something. And After Effects does not realize that the file that it had saved on the disk cache is now too old. So you go to that frame, and After Effects is like, I know that frame already. Here it is. But you're like, I made this black and white. Why is this frame black and white and this one not? Because I say so. So the disk cache is more buggy than it's helpful, so I usually turn it off. Turn it off. I think by default it's turned on. Just shut it down. Then, video previews is fine. Appearance. There's this one little checkbox that I find really annoying, which I always turn off, which is cycle mask colors. What this does is, if it's enabled, each time you create a mask, it gives the mask a color. Usually the color is yellow, so it's a strong color, you can see it on most elements. You can always change the color if you want. But with cycle mask colors, it always gives each mask a different color, which is nice because then each mask can be easily distinguished from one another. But the colors are just way too similar, and they are always like this pastel colors. So on most videos, when you mask out something, you cannot see the color because it's too pale. So I found it rather annoying than helpful, and I want all my masks to be yellow, and all is good. So here, just turn this checkbox off. Then, if you want, you can change the general brightness of the interface, but it's really just slightly of a difference. So here we can make it a little bit brighter or a little bit darker. There, it's really just a hint, not so big of a difference. We can even change the highlight color. So up here we can see the sample. We could say how it is more or less visible. But it's like, why do we have these super big sliders and this huge interface just for like 10% brightness? Why? And no force English button. I don't know.
Priorities.
Yeah. Like back in the days, with early versions of After Effects, you could actually make it so bright that at some point the interface got inverted. So you had a white interface with black colors. And After Effects was the first program that had the dark interface. So many people thought it was Photoshop because Photoshop was the first one where you were forced to use the dark one. It was on by default. But After Effects actually already had years before the black interface.
Do you like the black interface more?
Yes, definitely. Because I usually work in the dark, so I don't want a white screen always shining at me. So darker screens or darker interfaces are just easier to look at and make you focus more on the actual content. But I guess it's a preference. Then a new project is fine to autosave. After Effects creates autosaves. I think they are by default turned off, but you should turn them on. I actually set mine to save every 5 minutes. By default, I think it's set to 20, but you can totally set it to 5 minutes. What this does is, it always creates a new folder next to your project file. So when you save your file on the desktop, it creates a folder on your desktop called After Effects Autosave. And every 5 minutes, it saves a copy of your After Effects file into there and numbers it. So this is copy 1, copy 2, copy 3. And so on. So if After Effects crashes and you haven't saved in like 2 hours, you can be like, doesn't matter. I only missed 5 minutes or so. I go to the After Effects save folder and copy it from there. How many files are allowed in there per project is defined here. So maximum project versions. If you set it to 10, After Effects saves 10 versions. If it would then save the 11th, it first deletes the first one and then saves the 11th. So per project, we only have 10 versions. Otherwise, the folders might get way too big. All right, and here we just say that it should be next to project, but you could also maybe have an external hard drive and always save the autosaves to there. Sometimes that makes sense as well. But next to project, in most cases, is the most convenient place. Then memory. Usually, you guys have 16 gigabytes of RAM, and you could stick with the defaults, and 16 gigabytes is more than enough in most cases. So you usually don't have to change anything in here. And the rest here is fine as well. Good. Did I forget anything? We'll see later on. All right.
Why do I have type when nobody else?
European, Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern.
Where here?
Yeah, there.
I don't know.
Yeah, Middle Eastern and North Africa.
Text engine, European.
Language
and-
selection. Text engine.
Maybe you're special.
That's it.
Are you both Danish?
Swedish.
Close.
Pretty far. What version do you have of After Effects?
I actually have the previous one. I haven't installed the latest update yet.
Maybe that's why.
Maybe that is why.
I didn't.
Yeah, I also have time.
I didn't. I'm too late.
Yeah,
Oh, we are both special.
we are both special. All right, yeah. Don't know what it does. Don't care. All right. Are we ready to do something? All right. The very first thing that I will do is actually show you the folder script, which you can find by going to File, Scripts, and then we have a really weirdly ordered list. Usually it is ordered by name, but in the newer versions it's ordered by I don't know. It's completely random to me.
Huh? It is in.
Yeah, on We Are Special, We Are Older, but on newer ones it's usually weird.
Oh, it's also
By name? Alphabet? Special
You need to restart your After Effects first. Because we have installed the scripts, and the scripts are only loaded when you restart After Effects. So I guess you had it still open while we did the copying and stuff. Let's see if it worked. So here we have the underscore folder script. If you run it, really the only thing that it does is creates this folder structure here, where we have in the footage folder also folders for audio, pics, and video. There we go. This looks much better. And you can see there it is, there, underscore folder. Underscore folder. But it might be like in the middle of the list for some reason. All right, so now that we have these folders, we can import things into those folders. Do we all have the folders? Did someone say no? Got it? Good. All right. To import something in After Effects, there are many different ways. I will do it first. Afterwards, we do it together. The first way that I usually use is simply just selecting the files that I want to import, dragging it over, making sure that the folder that I want to put it in is highlighted, like pics is now highlighted, and I drop it. And then all the files are imported. So this is usually the quickest way. An alternative is by selecting the folder that you want to import it to, going to File, Import, and File. There you could also select the files that you want to import, hit Open, they're imported. Another option is to use the shortcut. You can see the shortcut when you go to File, Import, and File. You can see the shortcut, it's Command-I. So here I could have the folder selected, hit Command-I, and then I can also select the files and import them. Wait, there's one more. If you have an empty area in the projects panel, you can double-click it, and it will also open up the import. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 options to import files. It all results in the same thing. Unless we have Photoshop files or Illustrator files, then we get different options depending on how we import it. But we'll get to that when we get to that. So let's do it together. I usually prefer the drag and drop. So I have to find a window open, go to the folder that we got today, into the images, select all the images and drop it into the pics folder. If you accidentally drop it into another folder, into the trash for instance, you can just open up the trash folder, select the files, and drag and drop them in there. So pretty intuitive so far. All right. Next, we need a composition, because right now we only have files, but we need to put something somewhere. And as I said last class, the After Effects file is really just like the container thing, but we could have multiple, for instance, like Photoshop files or multiple artboards in here. And these artboards here are called compositions. To create a composition, also, there are many different ways. I will do it first. Way number 1, which I usually use, is I select the folder that I want to create a composition in, and then I click this button down here, which says Create New Composition. Then it gives me a couple of options. Alternatively, I can also use the shortcut, which is Command-N, or I can go to Composition and hit the New Composition button up here. Here we can also see the shortcut Command-N. But as I said, I usually use this button down here or the shortcut. So let's select the Master Comps folder and hit the New Composition icon. Then a composition settings pop-up pops up. In there, we have a couple of settings, and the first thing that we want to do is make sure that we all use the same preset. So here, let's click on the drop-down, scroll fairly down, and then down here, we have one that is called HDTV 1080-25. There are others that sound similar, but they are only similar, which means they're different. So up here we also have an HDV 1080-25, which gives us the wrong pixel aspect ratio. Remember, like pixels back in the days could be stretched, blah. So HDV is not good. It also sounds like HPV, so you can remember it like this. Not good. Instead, we want to use the HDTV 1080-25. Then, all the default settings should be fine. So we have a width of 1920 by 1080, we have 25 frames per second. The resolution here doesn't matter, we can set it to full. Start time code at 0, and the duration, yeah, let's give it 20 seconds. So it would be 0:00:20:00. So these ones here are the frames, these ones are the seconds, these are minutes, and you guessed it, these are hours.
Why did you deselect log aspect ratio to 16:9?
Doesn't matter. It's only if you say, maybe I want half of this. Then you don't have to change both of them to something different. But you could say, all right, maybe here I want this to be 200, and then the other one automatically adjusts with it.
What if you want one day using movies? The black thing?
There you would use probably Cineon or film. But usually what you export still is the 16:9, and you would just add borders to the bottom and to the top. And these black bars at the bottom and the top are called cache. So C-A-C-H-E. So it's written like cache, but pronounced like cache. Anyway, this all should be fine. There are a couple of advanced options and renderer options for the composition settings, but let's not go into them just today and just hit OK. By default, the background color here usually is black. This background color could always be changed in the composition settings. So, if you create a composition and you're like, damn it, I forgot something or want to change something, you can always go back here to composition and say composition settings and just change here the background color. So for instance, I could also make the background color white if I wanted it to, but I usually stick to black. Then, a composition by default actually always has a transparent background. But since there's nothing else behind here, it shows me black. If I do want to see the transparency, I can toggle it with this little button down here. So if you look very closely, there's one that already looks like a transparency grid, and when we click it, we switch between the black background that is kind of imitated and the actual transparency grid. So usually, as this is not really a black, or I can actually prove that this is not a black. So for instance, this is only me doing, if I change this to a greenish color, and I then take an emoji, I could change the blending mode of this, for instance, to multiply. But nothing happens, because this background doesn't really exist. So if I do a color correction, if I do blending modes, they do not affect this background, because this background just says, here's transparency, and instead of showing the grid, I'll show you this color. If you render out the video that does not support alpha, like in MP4, then also this color will be shown. So here, if I do want this color to be as a background color, I would actually need to create a solid. And now I have an actual layer, and now I can see it multiplies on top of that layer. So, the background color doesn't matter that much. Usually I stick to black, and if I want a background color, I really add a solid and use that as a background. I will show you in a bit how to create a solid. Also, there are different options. So let me go back here. The next steps I will actually do first, and afterwards we can do them together. What I want is, I kind of want to reimagine the background that WhatsApp has. So it's this kind of pattern here.
Yeah, if you don't have a picture.
Exactly, if you don't have a picture in there, then this is like the default, or when you use the web version. So, first I would need this background color. For that, I will create a solid. So usually when you want to create something and apply effects to it, to generate something, you always put it on a solid. It's a little bit like creating a new layer that already has a fill on it in Photoshop. The mostly common used way is to use the shortcut, and the shortcut is Command Y. In here, we can give it a size. Don't touch units or pixel aspect ratio because then things get weird. So just stick to square pixels and pixels. And usually the solids are comp size. So if you have input some other size and you're like, but I want this fitting exactly into my composition, just say make comp size and it will take the settings from there. Then we can choose a color, like in the other Adobe programs as well, and hit OK. Or actually, I wanted to pick this color. Well, I'll show you other ways to create a solid anyways. The other option is by going to Layer, New, and here we can create a solid as well. And here we also see the shortcut for it, Command Y. Then, if you don't like shortcuts and this is too much moving around because this is so far up, you can also right-click into an empty area of the Layers panel here, right-click, go to New, and here we have a solid as well. Then, to pick a color, I can just use the, I think it's called an eyedropper or something, the color picker, and I pick the color that I want. I hit OK, and now I have my pale orange, apparently, as my background. Next, I want my background pattern in there. I drop it down here, and I can see it is there, but it doesn't fill my entire background. So, what would you do in Photoshop? Duplicate it over and move it to the side. We could do that too. So we could duplicate this and move it over, and we can actually turn on snapping. So if I turn on snapping, I can see how it snaps to the boundaries of the other layer. However, snapping here is a lot different than in the other programs. So you don't have these smart guides that you're used to. Instead, first, depending on where you click, you will activate one of the corners. So, if I click close to this corner, it gets activated, and now that is the corner that will be used to snap to other things. So if I want this to snap to the center point here, I would click close to this corner, it gets activated, then it can snap to the sides or also to the center point. Or if I want this here to be snapped to the sides or to the bottom or to the center. So depending on where I click, the corner or point here gets activated and it will be used to snap to other elements. Oh, to copy you can just hit Command C and Command V, or alternatively, much better, is Command D to duplicate. So in Photoshop it's Command J, and in After Effects it's Command D to duplicate. Then the snapping has one more functionality, which is this one here. So as you might have seen, when I drag this, it can snap to center lines, to the outer boundaries, but it doesn't snap when it's outside or when it's away from the other element. If you want guides to be extended, a little bit like smart guides in Photoshop or Illustrator, you need to enable this option here. Snap along edges extended beyond layer boundaries. So if I now drag this, I can see how it creates this dotted line, showing how it snaps up here. So I don't know, they implemented snapping way too late. Like every other program already had smart guides, and After Effects just didn't, and then they came up with this. I mean, it is smart in some ways, it is convenient, but I just don't get why they don't have just smart guides like everyone else. Anyways, but this takes way too long. And After Effects is good for making things more effective. So it's not all bad. There's an effect that is called, or actually there are two effects that we can use, and one is called motion tile. To apply an effect, this is still just me doing. To apply this effect, you would hit, we need to set this up. Let's first set this up. You don't have the shortcut yet. Let's go to Window and go to FX console, which opens up a little panel here, right? So window, fairly at the bottom, there's the FX console, just JSX. Then there's a cogwheel that you want to click on. In here, you can define the color of the interface, but light just does not make sense. Let's stick with dark. And we have a shortcut. And the default, I think, is Control Space. But the issue is that on some machines, they also use it to switch languages. Or they have mapped Control Space to the Spotlight or something like this. Also, After Effects already uses the spacebar to navigate and to play back the timeline. So also using the spacebar for that shortcut, it's a little bit dangerous. So what I set it to is Control Tab, because that is usually not taken and it's pretty close together. You don't have to, I think it's easier to access. So Control Tab. Now that this is set up, I can have this layer selected and I can hit Control Tab and this little pop-up pops up. And in here, I can then say I want to apply the motion tile effect. So I type in motion tile. I don't even have to type it in till the end. It already is highlighted and I hit enter. Now, this layer has an effect applied. And I know that because here the FX is enabled. Up here, it should also open up the effects controls panel. So here I can see the motion tile effect is applied. Now by default, it does not do anything, but as soon as I change the output width and the output height, I can see that it now grows this layer by just duplicating it over. So instead of having to do it myself, I already have an effect that I can use for that. Let's do this together. So do we have the background color already? No? Good. Let's start by creating the solid. The shortcut is Command Y. Then, revert, undo, cancel. We want to pick the color already. So the first thing that we want to drop in is from the projects panel, the ref.png. Just drop it anywhere onto the scene here. To zoom in, you can either scroll up and down to scroll in or out, but I think it is way too sensitive. So what I usually do is I hit Z to switch to the zoom tool and just click to where I want to zoom into, or Alt click to zoom back out.
But why it goes in that corner?
Yeah, because the scroll is stupid.
Oh, I understood where my mouse is.
Yeah, a little bit. All right. So we see our pattern here. On your screens, it might look much, much paler than on the beamer because the contrast is different. To move around, you just hold down the space bar and then you can click and drag to move the entire view here. So you're not moving the layer, you're moving the entire composition in the viewer. So we see the reference image here. Then we hit Command Y to create a new solid. Choose the picker here to choose the color. Make sure that the orange solid that we are creating is comp size, so we hit the Make Comp Size button. And then we hit OK. We should then have a composition with this pale orange. So far, so good?
If you made a wrong color, how do you change it?
First, you should move it below the reference. So the reference is on top. Then select the pale orange, or whatever color yours is. Then go to Layer and Solid Settings. And then you get the same settings as you had earlier, so you can change it.
So, but you have to put it up behind, down?
You don't have to put it down, but if you want to pick this color, you couldn't pick it if it's behind the solid. That's why.
And then it's for this one, because of under the...
All right? Good. Next, we want to have the actual pattern in there. So we take the background pattern PNG and drop it above. If you don't drop it onto the viewer, but onto the layers panel, then it will be centered. So if I drop it here, by default, it's centered. If I, however, drag it over here, I can see how it's then floating, and it's placed wherever I let go. So, I usually want this to be centered, and then we want to apply the motion tile effect to it to make it larger. So we hit Control Tab while the background pattern is selected, and we type in motion tile. And usually motion T is already enough. Then we hit Enter to apply the motion tile. So Control Tab, type in motion tile, and Enter. And the effects controls should open up here automatically. The thing that we do want to change is the output width and the output height. So there, just click and drag on the values until it is a little bit larger than the composition. So you don't have to drag these values like crazy, then After Effects gets unnecessarily slow. You only need to make it grow a little bit beyond the boundaries. So far, so good? Let me pause. Next, we want to change the transparency of this. Do you remember where the transparency of a layer can be changed? Exactly, with T. So if you hit T, like opacity or transparency, it opens up the opacity. And here you can also just drag this value down, or I think it is 10%. It's very pale. Maybe even less, but I think 10% should be fine. Just T. Have the layer selected and hit T, and then it opens up. If we are happy with the opacity that we have, you can just hit T again, and then it disappears. Now, when we're happy with this, we could say this is now our background, and we don't want to accidentally click on it again. Right? So we would lock these layers. I think the reference we don't need anymore, so we can select the reference and delete it. And then we lock these other two layers. So now we can do other stuff, and this is now our background. So far, so good? Good. Now, let's actually take a look at how we could animate something. I will do it first, afterwards we do it together. I will take one of the smileys, and I will drop it, or emojis, and I will drop it kind of in the top left corner here. Now, let's say I want this to move from left to right. First, I need to think about what am I animating. I'm animating the position. So, I hit P. Then, I see that next to my P, there's a stopwatch. As soon as I want to animate something, I need to activate the stopwatch. So, I click on it. Just me doing. Then, I can see here, it automatically created the first keyframe. So when I move to the side, we can see how it's like this diamond-shaped thing. Then, I would go forward in my timeline, maybe to 2 seconds. I can see it either up here or in the corner here. So I could also just type in 2 seconds, and then I'm there. Actually, this window is pretty smart. So if I type in 1, it would go to frame 1. If I type in 200, it will go to 2 seconds. So if you want to go to a specific place, just write the number, but kind of like till the end. You don't have to write all this stuff in the beginning. So here, if I want to go to 30 seconds, I just say 30 seconds, 0 frames, and then it goes there. So 200 would then be 2 seconds. Then I would change my value. So I click and drag, and I move it to the side. I can hold down Shift, so it constrains to the X-axis. Here it is important that I first click and drag, and then hold down Shift. If I first hold down Shift and then click and drag, Nothing happens. Because then it thinks I want to select other things as well. So here, if I have these other emojis here, I have this selected, I could hold down Shift and click and drag to also select them, usually. There we go. So, if you want to move this to the side, first click and drag, then hold down Shift, then first release the mouse, and then Shift. Alright?
What happens when you first release shift and then?
So if I click here, hold down Shift, as soon as I release Shift, it will just go back to the mouse. So first mouse, then Shift, and again, first mouse, then Shift. So click and drag, hold down Shift, and release. Now After Effects has created a transition between the two. All keyframes by default have a transition between them. The transition here is shown with this line, so I can see it goes from here to here. The small dots that we are seeing represent the different frames. So I have 50 frames going from frame 0 to, actually I have 51 frames. Going from 0 to 2 seconds, and as I go through my timeline, frame by frame, by using the shortcut Command and the left arrow key, I can see how the anchor point jumps. Let me actually zoom in here. How the anchor point jumps from small dot to small dot. So After Effects just places the element wherever these in-between dots are. Then this is a linear transition. So if I go to the beginning and I hit the space bar to play this back, it starts abruptly and ends abruptly. If I want to see this a little bit better, kind of like in a loop, what I would do is I would move my slider maybe a little bit further than my transition goes, and I hit N for the end of the work area. This is my favorite shortcut. Like B is for the beginning and N is for the end. Anyway, so now we have defined our work area. The work area means this is the part that After Effects by default plays back and also loops. So I could still go outside of the work area, and outside of the work area I could still hit the play button and it plays. But if I'm within the work area and I hit the space bar, I can see how it plays through and it repeats.
So end means you end your composition.
Close, but not really. We still have the end of the composition over here. This is still the end of the composition. But this just means I'm only working in this area here. Also, when you render out the video, by default, it also only renders out whatever is within this area. So by default, it does not render out the entire composition, but only the part of the composition that we have highlighted.
Can you change that ending point?
Always. You can always move this to wherever. You could also say, I only want to render out or work in this small area in between here.
Is there any shortcut to go to a specific keyframe?
Kind of. You can first use snapping. If you want to go to a specific keyframe, you can drag the slider and hold down Shift, and then it will snap to the slider. To the keyframe. Alternatively, you can also jump between keyframes. So if I have a couple of more keyframes here, let me just create some like this. I can also use the shortcuts J and K to jump from keyframe to keyframe. So J jumps backwards and K jumps forward. But I hardly ever use the J and K. Mostly I really just move the slider, hold on Shift and let it snap. So this is a linear transition. It starts abruptly and it ends abruptly. We can also see that the motion is quite constant because all these in-between frames, these small dots, are distributed quite evenly. Let's do this together. We start by choosing one of the emojis. You can also take another one. I don't mind.
Where are the folders?
Oh yeah, if you don't see the project folder anymore because your effects controls is covering it, you can just hit the double arrows next to the effects controls and switch back to the project panel. Alternatively, you could also hold down the space bar and actually move this to the side and also see it. But I find that very unintuitive, so I usually just go here and choose it. In older versions of After Effects, they actually had a slider that you could click and drag. But they wanted to save space in the interface, so they did it like this. So let's choose an emoji and drop it into the top left corner, kind of. Because we will have a couple of more emojis further down the road. Then we move the slider to the beginning of the timeline if it isn't there already. With the emoji selected, we hit P for the position and we activate the stopwatch. The stopwatch only needs to be activated once. As soon as it's activated, every change that we do will be recorded, either in the current keyframe that we are on, or if no keyframe exists, a new keyframe is generated. Then we go to 2 seconds. You can either drag the slider until it says 2 seconds here, or you can also click onto the timecode and just type in 200. Then we want to move the element to the side. So we switch to the Move tool. The shortcut is V. Or it's actually called Selection tool. I call it Move tool. And we move the element to the right, hold down Shift, then we can release the mouse, and then we can release the Shift key. Good. Now let's see how we can look at this in a loop. For that, I would suggest to move the slider a little bit forward, then hit N for the end of the work area. And if you then hit the space bar while your slider is somewhere within the work area, it will start loading everything into the RAM, so you can see how everything is now green. And it plays the work area in a loop. So far, so good. Hit the spacebar. All right. Now, let's see what other sort of keyframes we have. Yeah? Then this whole thing doesn't make sense anymore. I mean, you can just pack your things and leave. I mean, now it's over. Alternatively, you can also select the keyframes, right-click on it, go to Keyframe Assistant, and say Time Reverse Keyframes. Yes, you can. You need to select at least 2 keyframes to be able to do that.
Sorry, I'm really tired.
So if I were to do the same thing here, it would then play the same animation, but this time, well, backwards. So far, so good? Yep. Good. All right. The next steps I will do first. Afterwards, we will do it together. Also, it might not be a bad idea to save the project once in a while, because if you have not saved the project yet, you will also not get autosaves. Just because the autosave is saved next to the project file, but if there's no project file, then it could not be saved next to it. Yeah. The worst part is if it doesn't work the way you want it to, but it kind of makes sense. And then it's like, I can't even say bad things about it. All right. So, the next one I will do first. Afterwards, we do it together, and then we will have a short break. I will take the next emoji and I will drop it underneath it. Then I will again want to animate the position, so I hit P. I make sure that my slider is at the beginning of the timeline. I activate the stopwatch. And now I kind of want to synchronize these two animations. They should be the exact same length. So down here you usually should still see the position animation. What I can do is I can move my slider, hold down Shift, let it snap to the other slider, and now I move this over to the side as well. Now these two layers, or these two emojis, are doing exactly the same thing, but I do want it to be different. I want to show you that they are different keyframes. So here, I will select the two keyframes, and I want to convert them to Easy Ease keyframes. There are different ways to generate Easy Ease keyframes, and I will briefly show you the different ways they are, and then I will show you how easy it is with my script. First, by default, there's a shortcut that is Fn and F9, so holding down the function key and then hitting the Fn key. Then I can see how my keyframes are changed. They are now, instead of these diamond shapes, they are now hourglass shapes. This is how they call it, hourglass. You can also think of this kind of like a square with subtracted linear keyframes on it. Depending on, usually it's referred to as hourglasses. Now this means that they are not linear anymore, and they can have any sort of easing. We can already see here that some easing is applied because these dots are not equally spaced anymore. So if we compare it to the other layer, up here we can see how each distance is the same, but here the distances are closer in the beginning, farther apart in the center, and then closer towards the end again. Which means, towards the end, the motion is, or the steps that it's doing are smaller, which means in turn it's moving slower. In the center, the steps are farther apart, so it's faster. In the end, it's still the same amount of frames that we have, but they're distributed differently. If we now take a look at this, we can see how the top one starts very abruptly and also ends abruptly, whereas the bottom one kind of starts a bit slower, speeds up, and then slows down. So it looks easier. Right? All right.
Can I also create just the first, or do I always have to?
Usually you do it on all of them.
But you can also just say on one. So
Yes.
that it starts slow, but ends abruptly.
I'll get to that.
Can you also change the physics?
Yes, I'll get to that. So by default, the easing that is applied is 1/3, or 33.333%. Where do we see it? We see it if we select a keyframe and we right-click on it and go to, don't do it, don't remember this, and go to keyframe interpolation. If I open, sorry, that was incorrect. I usually use the shortcut. Keyframe velocity, that's the one. And here I can see that the initial speed of the keyframe is 0, and then it has an influence of 33.3%. This is the default easing. And this results in this. How is this visually represented? If I select my position here and I activate the graph editor, I can see kind of a speed graph here. I will not go into too much detail what this does, but we can see that we have these tangents here. And the more I drag the tangent to the side, we can see how this curve changes. You don't need to understand the curve. But what you need to understand is that if this value here changes, we can also see that it says influence in the highlight here, right? So influence, before it was like 33 something, and then I drag it higher, and now it's 100%. So the influence is higher, so we can see how there are more frames here than there. So as I drag this slider, we can see how I'm distributing all the frames that are available. So the influence, you can kind of think of it as the more influence I have, the more frames I push towards that keyframe. Which then results in being slow here, getting really fast here, and then slowing down a lot towards the end. So if I play this back, I can see how it's a little bit like shooting. It starts slow, then shoots, and then slows down towards the end. Now, changing this with these things here can be a little bit of a pain, especially if you have to do it with multiple properties that all have different tangents. Because, wait, no, let me start that sentence again. Easings should always be the same if you have animations that should be synchronized. For instance, if you have a position and a scale that should change at the same time. If the easings are not perfectly, it looks like two different motions. Instead of zooming to the top right corner, it would be like, it just looks awkward. So these easings need to match perfectly. So it's not always a good idea to change these things by hand if you know multiple properties need to have the same easing. So, as we saw earlier, we could select keyframes, right-click on it, and go to the keyframe velocity and give these values. However, these values are always different per property. So for instance, here we have pixels, but when we have a radius, then we have degrees. And then After Effects doesn't know what to do, so we'll only change the values for one property at a time, which is annoying. So here my first script comes in. You can find the script by going to Window and going to any.green, which stands for any keyframe velocity. Only me doing still. This script is a dockable panel, so you can just grab the number here. So don't just grab the entire window, grab the name of it. Then you can see how you can drop it to some other place. And usually I put it right next to the info because I usually don't care about info. Or audio. I hardly ever use these, so I just put it there. Now we have a couple of options in here. First, we have the in influence and the out influence. Then we have an apply button, and we have a check and a copy button. The in influence and the out influence are kind of connected to one another. So if you know you want 50 and 50, you only need to type in 50 on the one side, and the script will automatically choose 50 for the other side as well. So here, I could select my keyframes, and I could hit apply, and I can see how my easing has changed. And now it is very similar to what the first easing was, but a little bit more intense. So it's a little bit slower at the beginning and the end, and a little bit faster towards the center. So here I could also go in here and type in 88, for instance, and then it will be super slow in the beginning, super fast in the center, and then super slow again towards the end. All right. You can also use the script to check what values your keyframes have. So if you have one keyframe, you can select it, and you can hit check. And then it will show you the easing very briefly at the bottom here. So you don't need to remember where to find the keyframe velocity. You can just hit check, and then you know what easing the keyframe has. If you like the easing of something, so if I say, I open up the script again, so I'm at 50 here, but I want the other layer to have the exact same easing, I can just select this keyframe, hit copy, then it copies the values of it. I can then select the other keyframes and hit apply. And now my both layers have the exact same easing. Alright. You can also use different values for the different sides. Here it gets a little bit complicated because it works the exact opposite way you would expect it to. But unfortunately it totally makes sense. So if I wanted to be very quickly at the beginning and then only slow down towards the end, so kind of like the shooting that I showed earlier, then I would have the first value here very high and the second value very low. By the way, I like to use values like 88 and 11 or 22 because it's just much easier to type. Also for 50, I'm like, 55 is close enough. They're so far apart. So, I select my keyframes, I have 88 and 11, and I hit apply. And you might now say, well, why is the influence here stronger? But my left value here is the higher value with a higher influence. The reason is that you should imagine your keyframe sitting in between here. This does not care about a transition going from one keyframe to another. this only cares about that one keyframe. So, imagine we have a keyframe in the center here, and this is the left half of the keyframe, and this is the right half of the keyframe. This is why it's called the in influence and the out influence. So, the in influence is the influence on the left-hand side of the keyframe. So this line here. So here we have the strong influence. For this keyframe, we have the outer influence on the right-hand side. So here it has less influence. So we have less frames here. So it totally makes sense. At first it is a little bit confusing because we only have 2 keyframes and you think of a transition between this one and the next one. But as soon as you have more and more keyframes, this starts to feel a little bit more natural. So the in influence is the left-hand side of the keyframe. All right. Let's do this together, and then we have a break. So we take a second emoji, and we drop it underneath the first one. Then,
But you cannot have also like the guides.
well, after you drop it and then move it again, then you get the guides. Drop it and then move it again, then you get the guides. I don't know, they have different snapping. That also. Alright, so we will move to the first frame of our composition, hit P like we did before for the position, and we activate the stopwatch. Do not deactivate the previous stopwatch, otherwise you delete the animation that you had earlier. So we activate the stopwatch, move the slider to the last keyframe that we have. It's best to drag the slider, hold down Shift and let it snap to the last keyframe, and then we can also move our other layer over. For some reason, when you already hold down Shift, it will not snap, which is totally stupid, but whatever. You'll get used to it. So first, activate the stopwatch. Then you can go, then move in time. Move in time. That is, no. Okay. Click and drag the slider to go to the last keyframe. Hold down Shift to snap. And now you can move it. Otherwise, you're just overriding the same keyframe again, so you don't get a transition. They will not snap. Alright. Next, we want to have some easing on here. And the easiest way to do that is with a script. So we go to Window, and we go to any.green. Fairly at the... Whoa, you don't have that. Let me fix that real quick. So we would go to Window and open up the any.green panel. To drop this panel, so usually it's opened up a little bit bigger, to drop the panel into your interface, you need to click on the name and then drag it, and then you get all these highlights, and then you just drop it right next to the info panel. So, or actually onto the info. And then it should be kind of merged together with it. Oh yeah, when you double click on a name, then it opens up in full screen. Which sometimes is nice. Like when you have a lot of layers, you can double click and then you can see all the layers much better. Or if you only want to see the composition panel here. So it's actually nice functionality. If you double click on a name of a panel, it will maximize. If you double click again, it reverts.
But otherwise, it doesn't show the...
Oh, yeah. Here, do you have an interface that looks like mine, or is it different? It is a bit different, right? So After Effects has these 2 types of panels. You can either have these normal docked panels, or you can have panels, and they're called panel group settings, stacked panels. So if I have a stacked panel group, I can see how this is now one panel and it's stacked. So depending on which one I click on, this is the one that expands. I'm not quite sure if I like it. Sometimes I try it for a while, and then I'm like, meh. Then I switch to the old one, and then I'm like, oh, I miss it a little bit, but do I miss it that much? So in the end, it's a personal preference. I don't have one. I always switch, and I haven't found like the answer if it's good or bad. If you don't like it, if you rather really have a regular panel, then you just go to the menu of one of the panels of that group, go to panel group settings, and disable the stacked panel group. And then you have these panels right next to each other. All right. Also, if you ever mess up your interface, you can always, let me just make this a little bit larger, always revert with these buttons up here. So usually, I actually don't have much of a customized interface. I keep most things where they are usually. So when you click on the standard, or this is where you usually are in, you can click on the menu icon next to it, and you could say reset to saved layout. And then it goes back to the default. So if you ever delete a panel and you don't know how to get it back, or move things around and you're like, oh damn it, now I messed up, then you just go up here to the standard, click on the menu, and say reset to saved layout.
I don't have these.
It might look a little bit different, although there it looks the same. Let me check. All right, so let me get back my panel. So, from the bottom smiley, which is actually at the top of our list here, we want to select both of the keyframes. So just click and drag a marquee selection across them. Then we go to any KV, and let's give it an interesting easing. Maybe 88 and 11. Then you hit apply.
And should always add up to 100.
Does this add up to 100?
Sorry. I'm tired. No, it doesn't add up.
But I get that question asked a lot for some reason. But no, it doesn't matter. You could also take 100 and 100. Window, and it should be in the list fairly at the bottom. Got it? When we have these selected,
So sorry, then the fact that it became a glass means that we are changing the time. Not only at first, but it means that, right?
exactly. So this means we have linear keyframes that don't have any easing. It is a constant motion. And as soon as we have these hourglasses, then we know there's some easing applied to it. It does not indicate how much easing we have. There we really need to select it, and we could hit the check button here to see what sort of easing it has. But as soon as they are eased, it's this shape.
And you use now 88 and 11, because it's only an example.
Exactly. So this just means it will start a little bit slow, get fast really quickly, and then it slows down a lot. All right. Then let's take a break till 8:30, and then I'll show you a couple of more keyframes.
Stop the recording, does it also stop the microphone?
Yes.
What
Yeah, so
kind of
up
what program is it?
ScreenFlow. So up here, when you see that there's a little dot in the camera, then I'm recording, and when there's a pause. But when I do my After Effects classes, then you don't see it because interface is too small. All right. Now let's take a look at what sort of other keyframes we have. So we already know they are linear keyframes, and they are easy ease keyframes, and that easy ease keyframes are kind of flexible because we can define how much influence each keyframe has on each side. Now, next I think I want to show the toggle hold keyframes. I will do it first, afterwards we do it together. I drop here another emoji, and I hit P for the position. I activate the stopwatch, then I go to kind of the center of the animation, move it to the center, go to the end of the animation, and move it to the right. Then I will right click on my selected keyframes and I will choose toggle hold keyframes. Now we can see how on the left hand side they are still a linear keyframe, but on the right hand side we see how we have this box. This box means this keyframe will be held until told otherwise. So if I scrub through, I can see here is no transition. Only when we reach the next keyframe, it jumps to that keyframe. Alright. So instead of creating an interpolation between them, or a transition between them, it just says, here I'm holding the keyframe until a new keyframe comes. Now, why is it only on the right-hand side and not on the left-hand side? There are also toggle holds that are shown both on left and right, but I have no idea what that means. I think there's no difference. They do the same shit. So here, for instance, it does make sense to have it kind of half and half, because here it means it's holding that value, but I could convert this one here back to a linear keyframe. By the way, to convert any keyframe back to a linear keyframe, you just command click on it. And then it goes back to a linear keyframe. Now I can see here, it holds the first keyframe once I reach the linear keyframe. Then it jumps there, and then I still get a transition, because here I have linear, and here I have linear as well. So here I do get a transition. But if I then had another keyframe back here that I would move down, here for instance you can see, because it detects there was a toggle hold before, now I have a toggle hold on both sides. Here it again, it toggles, then we have a linear transition, and then it toggles again. Alright, so if a toggle hold keyframe is a toggle hold on both sides or on one, I don't really see that there's a difference. Alright, so this one here also toggle hold keyframe. Let's do that together. Alright, so we are at the beginning of the timeline. We drop our emoji in here. We hit P for the position, activate the stopwatch. But instead of going to the end of the animation, we go kind of to the center, and we move it kind of to the center, and then we go to the end, and move it to the end.
What does it mean when the keyframe is circle?
I will get to that in a bit. Just click on it again, and we'll go back to a linear keyframe.
And the keyframe is what?
And the keyframe is a circle. There are also two circular keyframes. Yeah, there are a lot of keyframes. We want to select all three of them, right click on it, and say toggle hold keyframe. And when we then play back, we should have this almost stop motion kind of effect. So far so good?
Which one changes in linear?
All of them. You're already good. If you now hit the space bar.
But you said if you click on command or
If you command click on it,
only?
then you command click. So hold down command and then click on the keyframe. And then it goes to a linear keyframe. If you click it again, then it goes to a round one, and I'll explain that in a bit.
But it doesn't go back to the one
No.
which is...
So if you wanted to go back, you need to right click it again and say toggle hold.
How do you do that you can still see the direction movement of the emoji while you're playing video. And
Oh,
like this line,
yes.
because every time I press
Yeah.
space, it disappears.
Yeah, good point. Let me explain that now. Up here, we have the preview panel. In the preview panel, we do have a couple of options. First off, we have a shortcut. If you click on this drop down, you can see these are all the different shortcuts they are to start playing back something. So you can hit the spacebar, or Shift and the spacebar, or numpad 0, which on our computers is Control 0, or Shift numpad 0, or numpad period, or whatever. We don't use those. So when we select the spacebar shortcut, we can define what should happen when we hit the spacebar. So here we just see these are the available shortcuts, and here we can define what happens when that shortcut is hit. So on spacebar, it should include video, audio, and the layer boundaries. So for instance, if I turn off the layer boundaries, even though I have my layer selected, as soon as I hit the spacebar, the boundaries disappear. If the playback stops because I hit it again or I hit escape, I see my boundaries again. If I do want to see the boundaries while I'm playing back, I just activate it here. So now, when I'm playing back, I still see the boundaries of my selected layer. Then we could also say, maybe we don't want to see video, so if I now play this back, I only see the boundaries, but no video. Not sure when that would make sense. And I can also say that sound should be played back. But usually on the spacebar I don't want sound, because spacebar is the one that I always use. And most of the time you concentrate on animation and you rarely want to hear the sound along with it, only kind of like later on. And there you can either say, now I want to hear sound every time I play back, or you can just say, well, when I go to Shift spacebar, that there I want to hear sound when I play it back. So for each of these shortcuts you can say how you want them to behave. I usually have it that on the spacebar I only see something and view the boundaries, and on the Shift spacebar I see something and I hear something and I don't get boundaries. So this is kind of like the final output at the resolution that I choose here. Then there are a couple of more options down here, but I'll go into those a little bit later. So only up here are the important things for now that we want to adjust, if at all. Alright, so what you might have noticed is when you click on a keyframe, it switches back to the default linear keyframe, but when you click on it again, it becomes this thick circle. The thick circle means that this is now an auto key. The auto key means it will try to adjust the easing. It's kind of like an easy ease keyframe, but it will try to adjust the easing in a way that it gives you the smoothest transition. So I don't really have a good example because I never use them. But for instance, let me create a new composition here. If I have a little square and my square moves from the bottom left corner, kind of like up here, and then over here, and then here, like so. Now if I play this back, this looks a little bit, well, awkward, whatever. If I convert these into easy ease, what you did not know before is it will stop at each keyframe. So this easy ease means it will always start at 0 speed and it will always end at 0 speed at each keyframe. So when I now play this back, it looks like this. What the auto key does is, so if I click on it and I click on it again, what the auto key does is it tries to a little bit automatically make this look a little bit smoother. Also, when I change the angle, oh, this stays the same. But it's really only a little bit. So in most cases, they don't do much of a difference. There are more keyframes that are around, but I will show them over here. So the last keyframe that I want to show, I think I'll do it with this one here. I will do it first, afterwards we do it together. Now, let's say I have a more complex path, like in the composition I just did, where it should move to multiple places. I would hit P for the position, activate the stopwatch, then I go a little bit forward. Let's say I go to the center here. There, I want it to be up here. And then I go to the end, and I want it to be down here. But I wanted to do kind of a loop. So kind of this thing here. So you can see I can adjust these paths just like I could do with Illustrator or Photoshop. So I just grab the tangents and I can alter them. Now, when I play this back, this kind of works, but as we know, as soon as I change them to easy ease keyframes, this is not really how a loop behaves. I kind of want the keyframe in the center here not to really be a keyframe. I just need to define that it should move up here, but the easing should only be defined by the first and the last keyframe here. To do that, we convert this center keyframe into a so-called rove across keyframe. So when we right-click on it, I can say rove across time. I can see it again became a circle, but a much, much smaller one. And this time, it automatically adjusts in time to give me a proper speed ramp. This is also useful when you, for instance, have a map and you have a line or a dot that should go from one corner to the next. Then it doesn't go stop, go stop, go stop, go stop, or change the speed between the dots, but it can have a constant motion across the city. We will also have an example in that area. But first, let's animate this looping here together. We go to the beginning of the timeline and we create another emoji. Then we hit P for the position and we activate the stopwatch. We go to kind of the center of our animation and we move it up here. Then we go to the end and we move it down here. If you double click on a layer, just switch back here to the composition panel. This happens quite often at the beginning. If you double click on a layer, it opens up in the layers panel up here. It kind of has its own timeline. It looks a bit weird. Just click back onto the composition panel. Then you can grab the tangents and adjust them so that you get this looping or loop, whatever. So far, so good? Not quite sure what you mean. Alright, so now we know that the center point here should be a rove across. So this time I'm doing it kind of the other way around. So I already know that this is supposed to be a rove across, so I right click on it and let's say rove across time. Now this did not move because right now it is already at the ideal spot, since we have linear keyframes at the beginning and the end. Now let's shift select both keyframes. Usually I don't click on them. I usually always click and drag on them. It's more secure, then you really know it's selected. Otherwise, sometimes you click next to it and then you might select something else and then it's annoying. So clicking and dragging usually is the safest solution. And while you hold on Shift, you can also select or deselect that keyframe. With them selected, we can go to our any.green and hit apply. So when we now play it back, we also have a nice easing on there. If it feels a little bit too strong, we can also say, well, maybe instead of 88 and 11, we rather want to have 55 and 55. And hit apply. When we play it back, we can see how it is different.
Now that 55 applies only for the last? Or
For both keyframes, when you have both selected.
but when I selected only...
One, then it will only be applied to that one selected keyframe.
Yeah, but I mean before this, we used for
Alright,
second.
if you do it like this, then the 55 is applied still
Only
to both
for-
keyframes, but it's only affecting this half here.
Okay.
And this half here is still 11. Alright. So, these are all the keyframes that there are. We have the linear keyframes, the easy ease keyframes, the toggle holds, and the rover cross. And we have the auto key, but we saw that this hardly makes a difference. So, to be honest, I really never had a use for those. Alright. Other questions concerning keyframes?
Clear.
Good. Then let's take a quick look at how we can actually export this. I will do it first, afterwards we do it together. As I mentioned earlier, After Effects will export whatever we have defined in the work area. So if I define my work area back here, nothing would be exported. Or it would export something, but it will look like a still image because nothing is happening here. So if I do want this animation to be exported, I need to make sure that my work area covers it. By the way, the work area also snaps when I hold down Shift. Almost everything snaps when we hold down Shift. So here, if I hold down Shift. If I hold down Shift, it can snap to my keyframes. It can snap to the slider. And it's also true for the keyframes themselves. So if I drag this keyframe, it will snap to the work area or snap to the slider. As you can see, the rover cross still interactively adjusts its position. So here, the other keyframes don't talk to each other. You just move one keyframe and that's it. But this one here is always connected to the previous and the next keyframe. So, here I would set my work area maybe somewhere over here, and to render it out, I first need to send it to the render queue. I do that by going to Composition and say, up here, Add to Render Queue. Now, there's also the Adobe Media Encoder queue, however, that one sucks. It's slow, it doesn't support everything. That's reason enough.
Wait.
Adobe really wants you to use the Adobe Media Encoder queue. But to be honest, the story behind this is After Effects was able to export many different things. You could render out MP4s, whatever. But then they stopped doing that. And you could only render out a very selected amount of codecs. And I asked them, and they said, well, it's always so complicated to, with each update and version of After Effects, to check that all the codecs are still working, and we didn't want to do it anymore. So use the media encoder. That was the reason. They were just too lazy to implement all these plugins, all these codecs. So they started to give the user the option to send it directly to the media encoder, which has all the options. However, the media encoder has a couple of disadvantages. First, especially when you have a larger project, it takes a couple of minutes sometimes for the media encoder to actually open up the project. So you send it to the media encoder, sometimes it is there immediately, and sometimes you're not quite sure if anything is happening. You click here, the media encoder is opening, and then for 5 minutes nothing happens. You don't see a bar or a loading thing, nothing. And after 5 minutes the media encoder says, oh, now project is here. You can start rendering. So that is kind of annoying that you don't really have control over what happens. You don't know if this will work now or not. Then the issue is that the media encoder never supports transparent videos. So if you ever need to render out, for instance, a ProRes with an alpha for whatever reason, you can't. Then the media encoder, if you use the wrong preset, encodes it with some really weird shit, and then you have to render out the entire video again. So encoding is really a science for itself. So it's always best to render out sort of an uncompressed or lossless video from After Effects. This is your master. You know, this is exactly how it's supposed to look. And then you can start multiple encodings with a media encoder and see what gives you the best results. If you, however, render out these encodings directly from media encoder, it always needs to render from After Effects, encode, render After Effects, encode, render After Effects, encode. And especially when you do multiple encodes to see what works best, After Effects also needs to render multiple times. So, in most cases, it's actually even faster to render out a ProRes from After Effects and then encode that with a media encoder. This is how all the professionals do it. Adobe still wants you to use the media encoder, but as long as this sucks, it just doesn't make sense to use it. Alright, so the process is the following. We go to Add to Render Queue, and it opens up the render queue here, and it's listed down here. Now, in my case, it already gives me the ProRes 422 preset, which you don't have, but we will install it in a bit, or set it up in a bit. Then, on the right-hand side, I define where I want to save it to. So here it says output to, and I can click on the name. There I could say that I want to render it to the desktop. By default, it has the same name as my composition has, which you don't see right now, but over there. This one was just a test I did earlier. Then we can also choose the best settings, which you usually do. Otherwise, you could also go in here and say if you want to use proxies or use motion blur or not, or change the frame rate or something like this. But usually, we keep this at best settings. Then, here, sometimes people get irritated because they click save, but this doesn't mean that the video is safe, because the video first needs to be rendered out. So here we just save the location where the video should be rendered to. Then, we can hit render. And I can see how it renders through. I get this bling to notify me that I'm done. And now I can see I have my MOV here. I can hit the spacebar and I can see the video. And this is kind of the best quality that I can get. Also, this is a fairly large file. If I hit Command I can see that this is already 45 megabytes for a little more than 2 seconds. So that's usually not so good. When you render out a case film that is like a minute long or 2, then you also have a video file that is a couple of gigabytes in size. But that's fine, that's totally normal. What you then do is you use the media encoder to encode that. So let me open that up. This might take a little while. Also, when we do it in a bit, the very first time that the media encoder opens, it takes super long. I don't know why. Oh yeah, you could already open it up. Very smart.
For me it doesn't work when I click on media encoder. It's closing immediately.
I'll check it later. Yeah, also here, super long, and I don't know why. I mean, After Effects is a very big program and it opens up faster than the media encoder. I just don't get it. There we go. this is something else. In the media encoder, on the left-hand side, we have a lot of presets. On the right-hand side, we have a queue, and down here we have information about the encoding. I can simply drag and drop the video onto the queue, and then it's listed here. So I could also have multiple videos that encode after one another. In our cases, usually that doesn't happen, but if it does, you could also grab another video. I'll just take the same one again and drop it on here, and then we have two videos that we encode at the same time. If you already know that it's the same video file, then you can also encode it at the same time. So if items are listed as drop-downs like here underneath each other, they will render one after another. But you could also say that you want to render out a Vimeo preset at the same time. And then you can see it's listed down here, and then Media Encoder will encode both videos at the same time. So if you want to test different qualities and sizes, this is quite nice. So here, for instance, I could say I have a Vimeo 1080p and a YouTube 480p SD. So let's call this one maybe YouTube and Vimeo. And if I now hit the play button, I can see how both videos are encoding at the same time. Now they're done. And I have two videos. One, the one with the HD preset from Vimeo, looks fine, and the YouTube one, which looks a little bit different, because the YouTube video for 480p by default is 4:3 and not 16:9. So we have these bars at the top and the bottom. Concerning the file size, we can see how the SD version from YouTube is only a couple of kilobytes big, and the Vimeo is 3.8 megabytes, compared to the ProRes that we got from After Effects, which is 45 megabytes. So, the ProRes that you get from After Effects is really just for you to have a source, then you do the encoding, and when you're fine with the encoding, you delete the source. So the source is really just there so you can easily do multiple encodings at the same time, and you always have one version that is always the best. But if you are fine with one of the encodings, like this one here for instance, this looks fine. I don't see any artifacts or whatsoever. Then it's good. We could also push these settings. So for instance, I could say, let me just delete this and do another encoding. I could say I take, for instance, the YouTube HD, which is actually exactly the same as the Vimeo HD. I can go inside here, and I could say I want this to be even smaller. So by default, it is set to VBR1 pass, and the target bitrate is 16 megabytes, and the maximum bitrate is also 16 megabytes. So this means we have 16 megabytes per second. So if we have 2 seconds, this might be up to 32 megabytes, but it will not be larger. In this case, there's so little information, and it does not change from frame to frame, so the file will be naturally quite small. But when we have actually film footage, then we start getting artifacts quite quickly, and the files will also be larger. So here, if I drag these values very, very low, and I encode this now, the file size will be super small. So here, this is my new comp1. I can see how this is only 200 kilobytes in size, even though it's still full HD. So the size of the pixels did not change. But I said that it should use a very, very low bitrate. It's like taking a JPEG and saying I want to export it with low quality, like 4 or 2. But, just like with the JPEG, if I take a look at this now, we can start seeing some artifacts. So here, especially when it starts moving a bit quicker, we see how we get these unsharp, pixelated effects here also. So it doesn't look uncompressed anymore, and we cannot see our background pattern anymore. It's completely lost. So it's just like with the JPEG compression. The smaller the file size, the more artifacts we get.
What if you choose the 4K? Is it also going to be pixelated?
If we still have such a low bitrate, then yes. Because it doesn't matter. We scale it up, but then we still say save with a very low bitrate, then we have still a very crappy image. So the size doesn't affect the pixel size doesn't affect the size of the video in the end at all. It's all about the bitrate in the end. Make sense? Alright. Then, I think I'm closing it. Damn it, I didn't want to. Let's do this together.
Just update the media encoder and it works. Now it opens. I hope it opens.
Let's see.
No, it works.
That's so weird. But if you open up through After Effects, then it works.
No, for me I just went to my Creative Cloud and updated it.
Huh. Maybe you also just need to do an update.
But I updated like 1 week ago.
Okay, I didn't update.
Then maybe uninstall it and install it again. Maybe something got hung up. Anyway, so let's go to our composition, define the area that we want to render out. Then we go to composition and we say add to render queue. Now by default, yours will say lossless. And lossless is also good, but the ProRes will give you a much smaller file size and it will still look pretty much the same. So lossless is a little bit like saving a TIFF. And ProRes is a little bit like saving a PNG. So it is still kind of uncompressed, but you still see stuff. Actually, what I just said is a lie. But you can think of it a little bit this way. Because PNG is really a true lossless compression. The file gets smaller, but you don't lose anything. But with ProRes, you can lose a little bit of information. But it's so little that you can hardly see it. So it's fine. Anyway, to change our preset here, what you want to do is you want to click on lossless. Then you want to click on Format Options, the button in the top right. No, Format Options, it's a button, right? Right. Up, right, down. Yes.
It felt like I'm blind.
So Format Options, and there we can choose the video codec. And there we want to choose the Apple ProRes 422 HQ. Then we hit OK. And OK again. Now down here it says Custom QuickTime. Right next to Custom QuickTime we have a little arrow. Click on the arrow. And at the very bottom choose Make Template. Then it says Setting Name. So here we type in ProRes 422, maybe also HQ. And then already you can go up here. If you don't hit enter, you can click up here where movie default is and choose the ProRes 422 HQ as the default. So you don't need to hit enter next to the name, just go up here and in the drop down choose the ProRes 422 HQ. Then click OK, and every time you will send something to the render queue, it will take this preset here already, so you don't have to remember it. So far so good?
Can we do the last part again?
Anyone else lost?
Yeah, after the...
Just you two? Then I will come to you. I think it's easier. To define where we want to save this to. So we click on the name here. And render it maybe to the desktop. When we hit save, it will only save that it should be rendered to that location. To actually render it out, we hit the render button here. That sounded good. There's also a sound if something goes wrong. Wait, I can get it. So if, for instance, you're rendering something out and while you render out the video, you move an image that you're using, then After Effects is like, I can't render because that linked file is gone. And then it will sound like this. Yeah, but usually it should sound like that. Alright, so let's go to the media encoder and drop the MOV that we've just rendered out in there. So I can delete these two. And we take them off and we drop it in here. By default, it will say, usually, H.264 on the left, which means it will be an H.264 compression, which defaults to an MP4 container. So it's a little bit like a TIFF, where you could save it with an LZV, LZW, or a zip, or whatever formats, compressions. And here it's the same. So MOV could contain different encodings, and MP4 can contain different encodings. So they're all just containers. And the actual compression is inside of it. So just because something says MP4 doesn't give you a hint, or it gives you a hint of what is inside of it, but you don't know exactly what is inside of it. So H.264 means that it will be placed inside of an MP4 container, and it will have an H.264 compression, which is the default that everyone uses for everything. Then, over here, we have a couple of presets. If you use the drop down here, you can see all the presets that Media Encoder has concerning this format. If I, for instance, go to something like QuickTime, then I can see here that I have different presets. So, usually we choose the H.264 preset. Don't take the H.264 Blu-ray preset, because then you will get files that are only able to be burned onto a Blu-ray disc. You cannot play them on your computer. So regular H.264 is the one that we want. Also, do not choose MP4. It is a little bit irritating because MP4 also renders out an MP4, but with an MP4 compression. And the MP4 compression is very bad. It's not as effective and not as fast as the H.264. So both of these give you an MP4 at the end, but the inside is different. And it's the inside that counts. So we choose the H.264. Then we can see here that by default, usually it says match source, high bitrate, which is something that you can usually stick to. So when you choose this, the media encoder will detect what sort of size, what sort of frame rate you have, and stuff like this. And the only thing that you need to worry about is the bitrate, which is set here to 10 to 12. So in general, this gives you a good result. Here we can see that it estimates the file size to be 3 megabytes. But if you already know that you want to create something for YouTube or Vimeo, or you say, nah, I really want to have a very good quality MP4, then you should use the Vimeo 1080p or the YouTube 1080p. In the end, the file sizes will be fairly similar. There's only a slight difference, as I just saw. The nice thing about these formats is also when you upload them to their host, they don't need to encode it again. So usually when you upload something that is not the correct format, YouTube and Vimeo will create their own encodings, which is kind of stupid. If you upload an HD file and they have to encode the HD file again, then it's like saving a JPEG twice. But if you use these presets, then they don't have to save the JPEG twice. Then they only need to create the smaller versions. And there it's fine. You could also upload the ProRes, by the way. But with the internet we have, it usually doesn't make too much sense. So rather encode it already in the correct format here and then upload it to the specific host. So if I say, well, YouTube is fine, but then I say, well, but maybe I want the file size to be a little bit smaller, then you open it up, scroll down here in the list a little bit, keep everything as is, and the only thing that you do want to change is here the target bitrate and the maximum bitrate. The difference between the two is that the media encoder will always look at the frames and will see how much it can be compressed without looking too bad. So if there's a lot of information in the frame, it will rather use the maximum bitrate, so you see the compression less. But when we have a frame like this, where almost nothing happens, it can take a lower bitrate. And this is why the encoding up here is called VBR. VBR stands for variable bit rate. So the media encoder can detect, depending on what information we have in that frame or within that second, how much megabytes it wants to take up. So here I would get quite an optimal, but sometimes maybe too much compressed file. Also, just to show to you real quick, if you are in here already, what I do recommend is switching to VBR2 pass. It takes almost twice as long to render, but it will go through the video 2 times and double check if it really took the ideal bits. So we'll render out the video once, and then it will go through the video again and see if it could optimize something.
How do you get the
window?
There is
When
one
you
setting.
click on the preset here,
Yeah.
and then you're in there. And when you scroll down in the video, there you have it. So VBR means that it takes longer to encode, but it can result in a smaller file size and less compression that you see. So usually this is always better than this one, but it takes twice as long to render, or up to twice as long. Then we also have constant bitrate, which is the fastest, because there it just says this is how large each frame is, and done. And it doesn't compare frames, it doesn't see if it can optimize something. So this gives you the fastest encoding, but also the least optimum one. So here, more optimal takes longer, the most optimal, and the longest one. Alright, and then with these ones you just define how large the file in the end will be. Alright. To actually render this out, you just hit the play button in the top right corner. It will then encode the video, and then we have our MP4 here. And if we say, this looks fine, I can see everything that I want to see from the size, 4.2 megabytes is fine for what I want to do, then you can say, alright, I'm done, I delete the MOV, I don't need it anymore. Good. Are there questions? No. All right.
Is it the same for Premiere?
Yes. There, although there you can skip the MOV part. So with Premiere, you can actually export it directly with the media encoder. That connection works fine. And there you really just send it over to the media encoder, or actually you have the same interface within Premiere already to choose all the settings. Yeah. All right. If there are no questions, then I would say that is it for today. And we see each other on Saturday? Yeah, for the cinema people. And actually, if some of the After Effects people feel like exploring, I invite you to also join the Cinema 4D class, just to get a little bit of an overview of what the program does. Because I feel like you don't really know what it does. Yeah. So before
4D,
you...
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does 4D stuff.
Yeah, 4D stuff.
So I'm really serious. If you want to come on Saturday and take a look at what you can do, because from all the people who were on Quarterways, they said that all the agency were super impressed that they could do 3D stuff. It is a really valuable skill, and it can be super helpful as a graphic designer, as for digital design stuff, for animations, for still frames, for even for retouching stuff. You can do. So I really encourage you to also come to the Saturday class. It starts at 12. If you feel like, well, no, I don't really think that I need it, then that's fine. And if you think, oh, maybe this could be cool, then I'll talk to the office and we'll let you join in. So just none. This is the first one. Yeah.
We all only will have 5, right?
I think we're even just 4. Yeah, 4 or 5. Yeah. So
5 on the schedule.
oh, cool. So if you want to join in, just drop by, see if it feels like it could be something interesting. If not, then not.
No, one question. Maybe you can answer it or not. But of course, it was a joke that you can do 4D stuff at this point. Why is it called cinema 4D? Is it like?
I think A, it sounds cool, and B, the 4th dimension I think is counted as the time, because you can also do animations. Like you have 3 dimensions, and the 4th dimension would be time.
Ah, okay.
Maybe. Yeah. Sometimes they usually use it for motion graphics parts. So for instance, in Tron, many of the interface elements or all the elements that you see in the Iron Man suit, like, and the helmet is a combination of Cinema 4D and After Effects.
What is Maya for then?
Maya is then for the actual 3D movies. So when you see Pixar stuff, they often work with Maya, but with a lot of programs that they've built themselves. And then Maya is also used for stuff like Transformers or stuff like this. So when you have like real VFX shots.
I have a little question. What do you do actually? Like, what do you like?
I like chocolate. What is the question?
Like, what do you do like when you work? Like, what's the thing that you do?
What do you do when you're not here?
Yeah.
Oh, what I do when I'm not here?
What do you do when you cancel a class?
I just sit back, relax, laugh. No, didn't I introduce myself in the first After Effects class? Yeah.
Never a good listener.
I work at a post-production in Hamburg, and we do a lot of commercials, but also short films or online stuff like explanatory videos.
Have you done anything
And
that you might have seen?
sure. But lately, nothing really great. All the cool things are usually online things that are not pushed in TV. So all the stuff that you might have seen is more like boring daily business.
What is the name of the agency? Okay.
They're called NHB, which stands for Never Heard Before. Yes. They started out as a sound company. They only did sound. So like they were composing music or recording voiceovers and stuff like this. And they added the video, but briefly after they were founded. Ah.
Since when do you work there?
About 6 years.
So this was also your first company?
Yeah. In between, I was at 2 different companies, but I got back.
You got
I went back.
better work?
Yeah, and I also never really wanted to leave, but people made good offers. And my boss said, well, if you want to go there, that's fine, at least come back soon. I was like, okay, I'll do that.